So coming up this weekend, we're going to be going back to the Apex, but actually for a pretty good card, in my opinion, with a pretty cool poster. So we are just recording this video as soon as UFC 321 did end, and I will admit that card did end on a bit of a low note. It was a bit unfortunate that Garn did try and take a book out of Tom Aspinall's arch nemesis sort of skill set with the double eye poke on Aspinall, ending the fight early. That really, really sucks. It did look like Aspinall was starting to gain a little bit of momentum after Garn was landing a bit of volume. But aside from that, I think that I picked the card quite well. Now, of course, picking Rakic was not my brightest move, but I will say I did pick a couple of guys that if they did get the decisions, like maybe Jose Delgado, maybe Almeida, even though I really just kind of hate the way that Almeida fights, the card could have probably been one of like a crazy, crazy good one. But, you know, that is life, and we just got to keep trudging forwards. And as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a pretty good card, and I think this is a pretty cool poster as well. Now, I will say, being an Apex card, you can always expect some bum fights on here. Like, there are just some really, really horrible fights on this card, but I will say for an Apex card, it's pretty cool. And this poster's sick. I don't know what it is. I think it might be the stripes. Like, it almost looks like these cars racing, like on a drag strip, and then these two are kind of over top of it. But I like this card poster a lot, and I like the card too. If you do want to see a bit more, of course, unfortunately, Jacob's lock of the week streak did end with Quill and Cell killed winning by knockout, but he was on an absolute streak. And also, I think Angelo and Jacob have been doing quite well over the last few weeks as well, especially last week. You can check out wewantpicks.com and use my code ARTEM. And over the summer, when I do have a bit more free time, because as you guys may or may not know, I'm in the middle of my study week. In fact, actually, study week has ended. My first exam is going to be on Wednesday. So that's in like 3 days. I need to lock in and get studying a bit more hard than I have been over the last week or so. So you probably won't see me again until later on in the next week, probably. But Talita Alencar takes on Ariane Carnelossi to start the fight. Card, I just don't think this is a very like great fight. I mean, I know that Alencar does have a lot of BJJ experience, and I think that has kind of showcased somewhat in her fights. But there's one thing about her that I think is really going to kind of be shown in this matchup in particular, and that is the fact that she is very small for the division, and she's not very strong for the division as well. We even just saw this actually in the last card that Mizuki won over Jekyll and Amarim, where Amarim just isn't that strong and Alencar isn't. And look at Carnelossi. Now, the thing about Carnelossi is she hasn't had a good performance, in my opinion, in a very long time. Last time she fought was 18 months ago. Before that, she hadn't fought for 2 years, lost to Godinez, and then before that, she was looking okay, but over who? Estela Nunes and Nali Young? Not really good wins. However, the thing about Carnelossi is I do believe that she's going to be able to keep the fight on the feet against Alencar, and Alencar is not a good striker. I know that Carnelossi is not a good striker either, but I think she's a little bit better. I think this is like a Durden versus Jandaroba situation, which I know that Durden is one of the worst strikers in the divisions, but, you know, she's probably better at striking than Jandaroba, so I picked Durden. But yeah, I think Carnelossi can just outmuscle her, keep the fight on the feet, and I think that also even in the grappling, she can just be so strong, she can kind of maintain top control and avoid the submission threat from Talita Alencar in this matchup, so I am going to be picking Carnelossi in this fight. And then we have Phil Rowe as he does fight against Seok Ko. Seok Ko, now I like him. I'm just a little bit frustrated with myself because I don't think you guys understand how much I wanted to pick him to beat Aubin Elliott. I've been saying for a long time that I don't think Aubin Elliott is very good. And Seok Ko is a former Sambo world champion. I'm pretty confident the year he won the Sambo world champs was in 2019. He was the first South Korean to ever win the world championships in Sambo. And I think it does kind of come in his fights, especially in the UFC so far. I mean, in the Contender Series, he out-wrestled Cavalcanti quite a lot, out-wrestled Aubin Elliott, which is quite impressive because if Elliott's good at one thing, it is wrestling. But the thing about him is on the regional scene, there are a lot of red flags. The striking defense is quite concerning. The level of competition was terrible, and in some moments, he didn't even look that good against these really low-level guys, but maybe he has just really stepped up to the plate now that he is fighting against better competition. And Phil Rowe's going to be one of those guys. You know, Phil Rowe's a pretty tough fighter to get out there. He did end up getting a late finish over Angelusa in a fight which he really needed to win because maybe he was fighting for a new contract on that fight there and they really made it happen later on. Phil Rowe kind of is like a Neil Magny type fighter. I mean, he had a really terrible fight against Magny himself, where he does fight from range. He's 6'3" with a nearly 81-inch reach, and he will be trying to keep the fight on the feet against Seok Ko. But the thing is, if Seok Ko can just get the wrestling going like he could against Aubin Elliott, I do think that he can find success. The thing about Seok Ko is he can box pretty well too. I just don't really love the striking defense, as I did mention, but I am going to be picking him in this fight, and I believe that he is a favorite at minus 180, and Phil Rowe is a underdog in this matchup. Now we have one of those other fights, which I just don't think is a good fight. I think Ardelean wins, but if you are putting minus 400 money, maybe minus 500 money on Ardelean, I really don't know if I can really help you with anything, because this is just not a fight you should be playing 4-1 odds on. You know, Ardelean is not a good fighter. She was kind of signed out of nowhere. Hasn't actually beaten anyone like of any note at all, except for Ariane dos Santos. Before that, she was just absolutely can crushing. I don't really know about this matchup too much, but Conejo Ruiz, it's the same situation as before. She's way too small for the weight class. She is a wrestler, but she just isn't strong enough to be able to get the takedowns, and she just hasn't had a good run in the UFC over the last few years, sorry. And I think Ardelean does beat her. Now, I don't know if Ardelean can finish her necessarily, but I would be very surprised if Ardelean lost. But once again, minus 400 on a pretty low-level fight. I just wouldn't be betting on this fight at all, to be honest with you. Now, Ketlen Vieira takes on Norma Dumont, and Dumont's been on a pretty good run recently since she has been able to make that 135-pound weight class. And I was trying to find one fight in particular, but it turns out I cannot. I think it was this Carol Rosa matchup, and I think that you can kind of find some similarities between Vieira and Rosa when it comes to this, because Rosa and Vieira are both pretty aggressive Muay Thai strikers on the feet. And the thing about this fight as well that is going to be quite interesting, this is at 135. Yeah, it is. I was going to say, I'm pretty confident the UFC removed the women's featherweight division, is Dumont is actually going to be fighting against a fighter now who actually might have a size advantage over her, because Vieira is also very big for a woman's bantamweight, and of course Dumont has been someone in the past who's been saying that she could never make women's 135, but now she kind of has to. I think in this fight, you know, Vieira is going to be aggressive on the feet, but I think Dumont's just kind of be trying to do a bit of everything, you know, where Dumont does strike from range quite well. She does stall up against the cage quite well as well, and I think just in general, we're going to see her win this matchup. Now, I don't really... This is the fight. I always have one fight on the card which I just cannot break down to save my life. I will say the thing about Norma Dumont is she just doesn't have any finishing ability at all. That is where I was getting to. So, when it comes to Vieira, we have seen Vieira get knockouts. We've even seen Vieira get submissions in the UFC as well. We haven't. Wait, am I living in 2017? I'm living in 2017. Wait. Where did I even get that information from that Vieira was powerful? She's obviously not. I'm just making stuff up in the middle of this fight. I'm picking Norma Dumont. Let's avoid that absolute disaster. But the reason why I'm picking Dumont is because I do believe that she is more well-rounded, and I do think like, actually I really thought that Vieira got a knockout recently. Did I get her confused with someone else? I don't think I did. I think that Dumont is going to have to mix in wrestling as well as some of the striking. Donte Johnson fights against Sedriques Dumas. Now, we cannot mistake these two guys. Donte Johnson, of course, is a former light heavyweight. Took a very short notice fight, of course, at heavyweight against Darion Abbey on the Contender Series. I believe it was the first week, or maybe one of the first weeks anyway. And ended up getting it done there. And then he was kind of saying that he wanted to fight at welterweight. He hasn't quite made it down to welterweight yet, but he is fighting at 185 pounds now against Sedriques Dumas. And if Donte Johnson really does walk around at 200 pounds or so, to be fair, making 170 isn't super unrealistic. The thing is, though, I just don't know how much I love his skill set at 170 pounds. I think that Donte Johnson's skill set actually does suit the 185-pound division quite well, and he was doing quite well for himself at 205, but if he is walking around at 210 pounds, then, you know, he probably isn't a light heavyweight naturally, really. But he did beat James Ford, who was a pretty good prospect at the time. He's a wrestler. Before that, wasn't really beating anyone good, but he did go out there against Abbey and he knocked him out pretty quickly. He wins most of his fights in the exact same way, and it is just with very aggressive boxing combinations. And I will say, to be honest with you, he does kind of fight in a way that does sort of show some levels of inexperience just because he really is just aggressive all of the time and he doesn't really offer too much more than that, really. But I think that it's going to be enough to knock out Sedriques Dumas on the feet. The thing about Dumas, though, honestly, is I was quite tempted to pick him because he has actually impressed me in quite a few performances in his career. I just don't know if I can really kind of this is really bad terminology, like pull the trigger on picking Dumas, you know, because he just hasn't shown that finishing ability in the UFC. But the thing about him though is his kickboxing is genuinely quite good. And I think that his wrestling he actually has shown in the UFC as well to be quite good too. But at the same time, I think that the aggression of Donte Johnson is just going to end up overwhelming him. I think this is a situation where Donte Johnson, just with his style, with his aggressive boxing, he's just going to keep on winning until he eventually kind of maybe takes on just a bit of a higher level of competition or someone that I think has the skill set to match that firepower. And I just don't think that Sedriques Dumas, with his rangy kickboxing style, can do that. I think that Donte Johnson's just going to close the distance and he's going to end up knocking him out. Kind of like Mikhail Olachechik did, even though that was with a bit of ground and pound involved. I think Johnson gets it done. I think the odds for this one, I was going to say, should be quite close. They're not. Minus 260 for Johnson. I think that could be wide, guys. I'm not that confident in him. However, I'm probably more confident in Chang Ho Lee winning this fight, and he is a very, very slight favorite in this matchup. Minus 115 over Timmy Cuamba, who's minus 105. And the reason why I'm picking Chang Ho Lee in this matchup is because we have seen Timmy Cuamba struggle with some grappling in the past. Now, I will say he has shown a lot of I'd say in the UFC, he has shown a lot more resilience than he has shown in the past. But against Ivan Tenner, this is a matchup that I always just kind of go back to. He just didn't try and fight out of the rear naked choke at all. And ever since I kind of saw that, I think now that he's just taken a wrestler, someone that's going to put him in rough positions on the ground, I think that Chang Ho Lee's going to find a lot of his success. Chang Ho Lee, of course, is a guy that did fight on the Road to UFC tournament. He ended up beating Xiao Long in a very close fight. And then after that, ended up finishing Cortavius Romeus with ground and pound in a matchup, which he did look very impressive in. The thing is, though, Romeus, I just don't think that he necessarily is UFC level. However, I do think that Chang Ho Lee has a pretty good style to maybe beat Cuamba. The thing is, though, he is going to be at a very big striking disadvantage, though, in my opinion. I think that Timmy Cuamba, is this at 135 as well? It is. So Timmy Cuamba's coming down to 135. That's going to be a tough cut for our boy Timmy, I will say, because I did think that he was a little bit small at 145, but I didn't think he was that small at 145. But I think that, yeah, Lee, I kind of like Lee now more, actually, because that wrestling, because he's always just going to constantly be wrestling, is going to sap on Timmy Cuamba's cardio in this matchup. The Cuamba, though, as I was trying to allude to before, has really good boxing. He does throw a lot of boxing combinations. He throws a lot of volume. But I think that Lee, if he can get the fight down to the ground, I think that his control is good enough to kind of hold Cuamba down. So I'm going to be picking Lee in this fight. And he's a very slight favorite. Speaking of very slight favorites, he's not anymore. He was minus 145 earlier on in the week. Billy Elekana. I think that this guy, there's no way he loses to Kevin Christian. I'm just going to say it. This is one of those fights. He's not minus 800, and I'm saying there's no way he loses. He's like minus 250 right now. Minus 240. He was minus 145 earlier on in the week. Like, that was perfect value to jump on if you got onto that, because I'm telling you guys right now, I have never seen a worse fighter get signed off the Contender Series than Kevin Christian. This guy is probably the worst fighter in the UFC. And to add on to that as well, it is at 205 pounds. I think Elekana has been rumored to fight at 185, so I had to double check that. But, dude, this guy is just terrible. He's striking so bad. I don't know how he beat Francisco Mazzeo. That was just embarrassing. Mazzeo's lost since then as well. Just some really bad fighters too. And then before that, like, he's just beating like guys 6 years ago. Just absolute. He cannot strike. If Alekana loses, I'm going to lose my mind. All right, I've been going crazy enough as it is. Trust me, Alekana is the better striker in this matchup. It's not even close. He just beat Ibo Aslan on the feet. It was terrible, I know, but he should knock out Kevin Christian. If he doesn't knock out Kevin Christian, I'm going to be absolutely shocked. Absolutely shocked. And now we have Allan Nascimento as he fights against Durden. I think Durden actually just accepted this fight on quite short notice, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, I believe he is replacing Estevam, and I do believe this fight was only announced a couple of days ago, if I'm not mistaken. So Durden coming in on short notice, and I just don't think it's a good matchup for our boy Cody Durden. Now, I know what the comments probably are going to say. Yes, it is true. I actually have hyped up Durden quite a lot in the past. I actually have at one point really believed in Durden as a fighter. I really did believe at one point he could have gone on a pretty good run. But it just kind of seems like right now, he just isn't quite good enough to beat either the up-and-coming guys like Van, even though Van's a contender now, obviously, and Ochoa. I did pick him to beat Ochoa. He was beating Ochoa until he wasn't. But yeah, he just hasn't been able to beat this level of competition. And Allan Nascimento, I believe, has firmly cemented himself in the top 15 at 125 pounds. The problem is this guy can't make weight is one thing, and he doesn't fight often enough is the other thing. He fought 4 months ago, but before that, he hadn't fought for 2.5 years. Before that, he hadn't fought for a year. Before that, and then before that, he was kind of active, I guess, at the time. But like Allan Nascimento, one of the biggest flyweights there is on the entire roster, the size advantage he will have over Durden is quite significant because I'm not entirely convinced that Durden's 5'7", and if he is, he's not a tall 5'7". And Nascimento, as I was saying, is absolutely gigantic. He's a really good grappler. Once he gets top control, he's very hard to get out from underneath of. Durden's a wrestler as well. Very high pressure wrestler. And another thing about Durden as well, that is something that has just fallen off a cliff recently, and I haven't been able to figure out what it is his cardio, man. Cody Durden used to be a guy that you could rely on to push a pace for 3 rounds. But against Van, death gassed in the second round. Against Ochoa, started gassing out towards the end of round 1. Against Silva, gassed out against Ulanbekov. Like, this guy, you just cannot really rely on him to kind of keep the pace going anymore. And against a much, much bigger opponent, I just don't think that Nascimento is going to really struggle with Durden. And it's sad for me to say because I do like Durden. But I think Nascimento is going to sub him in this fight after Durden maybe wins round 1 and then gasses out afterwards. I think Nascimento wins, and he wins by submission in this fight. I think if Nascimento can sort out the weight cutting or even move up to 135 pounds, I think that he could look quite good. Charles Radtke's fighting against Daniel Frunza. Daniel Frunza is absolutely terrible at fighting. So if Radtke kind of wants to keep proving to us that he does have something going, he needs to beat Frunza. Frunza beat the absolute shell out of Vadim Kutsi, and I found out after the fact that Kutsi wasn't even training. So yes, he's got a win over someone that's 17-1 that has a win over Ismail Nahdiev, by the way. Which, of course, is why I picked him to win the fight, right? But, anyways. He hadn't been training. He just showed up. And no wonder he just showed up, because Frunza beat him. And then Frunza looks terrible against Rhys McKee. Got knocked down 4 times in that fight. Radtke's not that good. I'm pretty aware of that. But at the same time, he does have decent enough boxing. The guys that he's lost to are Mike Malott and Carlos Prates, guys that are in the top 15 now. Malott, I would spit if I wasn't inside my own room. I think that Radtke should be able to pressure Frunza and box him up. The thing is, about Radtke that was so impressive to me, I'm going to open up his Tapology profile again, on the regional scene, was his grappling. Dude, this guy submitted Raheem Forrest in the first round, and I know that this is a win that hasn't necessarily aged well, but you got to trust me, guys. Raheem Forrest is a talented fighter. It is just a shame that it has aged quite poorly. Now, I think in this matchup against Frunza, who's just a striker that's quite sloppy, I think that Radtke, if he doesn't just box with them for the whole fight, which I think would be a mistake, I think if he gets his wrestling and grappling going, I think we're going to see Radtke find a bit of success. And I honestly think the fact that he's been TKO'd twice now, we probably will see a bit more of that wrestling and grappling out of Radtke, because I would guess he probably has lost a bit of that confidence he had in his hands. So give me Radtke by submission. He needs to beat Frunza. I just do not think that Frunza is a talented fighter at all. And speaking of talent, I think both of these guys are really good, and I think Dulgarian is really good. And I'm not sure if those odds are correct, are they? I was just looking at these before the video, and Dulgarian is minus 200. Well, I am picking an underdog after all, huh? Because I am picking Yadier Del Valle. Now, the thing about Yadier Del Valle is I just think in general he's a bit more well-rounded than Dulgarian. But here's the thing. Dulgarian should be undefeated. He did beat Christian Rodriguez. That's a really bad decision. I think there's been a string of bad decisions that have gone Christian Rodriguez's way. And to be fair, he did just beat an absolute can and Brandon Marot. But aside from that, he beat. Okay, to be fair, he hasn't actually got really good wins, but the skill set is there. Trust me. And when you see obviously Isaac Dulgarian go out there, he's just constantly shooting takedowns. He's a friend of the We Want Picks channel. He's a friend of Jacob, I do believe. But I'm sorry, I actually do quite like Yadier Del Valle, and I think the fact that Yadier Del Valle did beat Michael as well, sorry, on the regional scene, over 5 rounds as well. I think that this is a very it was over 3 rounds. I'm just making shit up in this video, I know. I remember Michael Aswell gassing out in that fight, and Aswell's got good cardio, which is why I thought it could have been 5. But Yadier Del Valle beat Michael Aswell over 3 rounds, and in that fight, Michael Aswell claims he didn't get dropped. I think that Yadier Del Valle dropped him, but Aswell did comment on my Contender Series prediction video saying that he didn't. But I do think Del Valle did drop him in that matchup, and the boxing's pretty good against Pena Alamov. Once again, like a guy that hasn't really been winning a lot recently, but Pena Alamov is just a really annoying wrestler to fight against because, oh my goodness, all this guy does is shoot takedowns over and over and over and over again. It's ridiculous. And he was able to defend a lot of those takedowns and win the fight on the feet in a pretty close one. Against Monteiro, Monteiro only attempted 3 takedowns on him. I actually have it on here prepared. And he got 3 of them, and Del Valle was the one attempting the takedowns against Monteiro, which is interesting because Del Valle was actually a bit of a grappler. So I'm trying to say, I think that Del Valle is just a little bit more well-rounded in this matchup. I think that on the feet, purely on the feet, he is the better striker. Now, Dulgarian is a very legitimate wrestler that I think is very underrated in his skill set. I think that once he gets a takedown, he's going to be hard to deal with for sure. But I believe in Del Valle, I do. So I am going to be picking Del Valle to win this fight as the underdog. It looks like most of Tapology is picking him to win too, but I just don't think that you should really underrate Dulgarian in the spot either. Now, Jeremiah Wells fights against Themba Gorimbo, and I need to be honest with you guys. I don't think either of these guys are very good. I have been waiting for so long to fade Themba Gorimbo. Remember when people were picking him to beat Vicente Luque? That was absolutely insane. He was the favorite against Vicente Luque, which is just even more ridiculous because I just really, really don't like Themba Gorimbo striking. I think I can respect the wrestling and I can respect the grappling, but on the feet, dude, it's scary. It's scary to me. But the thing is about this fight is, yes, Jeremiah Wells has a lot of power on the feet. He also has non-existent wrestling. He's a typical Renzo Gracie Philly guy who just cannot wrestle. He cannot strike to save his life, even though he's got KOs. And he's got a lot of BJJ. So it's kind of one of those tough ones where you can look at Jeremiah Wells and you can look at the crazy knockout run, or finish run, I should say, including the submission of the the Great Blood Diamond. Oh, that's a throwback, huh? Holy shit, I haven't seen that name in a while. And then against Matthew Semmelsberger, you could argue that he lost it, but that was just Semmelsberger showing some of the worst fight IQ of all time. But Gorimbo. Let's talk about our boy Gorimbo here. He did come into the UFC with, I wouldn't say a lot of hype. I don't think anyone was really kind of backing him. However, he does have a very cool story. He is doing a bit of charity work for his home back in, I believe it is, Zimbabwe. And he did beat Takashi Sato, who, for some reason, I keep thinking is a good win, even though he had such a terrible UFC career. Knocked out Pete Rodriguez in 32 seconds, which was insane. And after that, we just saw a bit more of that wrestling and a little bit more of that sloppy striking to beat Brahimar, which is a win that, oh my goodness, has that aged well, huh? But I think against Wales, I think this is actually kind of like another sort of consistent level of competition to what he was beating before. And kind of just using that logic, I am going to pick him to beat Jeremiah Wells. But the thing about Wells is, yes, his striking isn't very good. He is a Renzo Gracie Philly fighter after all. But he's got a lot of power, and he does have the power to knock out Themba Gorimbo, because that's the thing about Gorimbo, which I was trying to get to before when I said I didn't like his striking. He's got a lot of offense, but he's got no defense. And if you do go in there and just kind of start throwing overhands and throwing these kind of sloppy techniques, eventually it probably is going to get you caught like it did against the great Vicente Luque. But I don't know if Wells necessarily is the guy that's going to do it. I think that this is a close fight. I think it's a fight which is, if Wells wins, it's going to be by finish. I think that's probably a given, to be honest. But I think Gorimbo can go out there and get the takedowns on Wells. Make it a bit of a scrappy fight. I think it's going to be scary if you have money on Gorimbo because Wells is going to be like nearly finishing him, I think, in some moments. But I think that we are going to see Gorimbo come out on top, show that toughness, and win a decision. Wado Cortez Acosta fights against Ante Delija. I struggle with this fight quite a lot, because part of me wants to pick Ante Delija because he did prove me wrong, because in his UFC debut, I actually did pick Marcin Tybura to beat him, by the way, and how bad was that pick, huh? But the thing is, Marcin Tybura looked so useless in that fight. He looked old, he looked slow, he looked terrible. And was that Marcin Tybura just being really terrible at fighting and the rest of the UFC division just is so unskilled that he can beat these guys? Or is Ante Delija actually so good that he was just able to pressure Tybura and he hit so hard he broke Tybura immediately into the fight? Because if you do watch that fight, Delija does just come forward and just start spamming combinations like straight punches. So he didn't really show a lot that I hadn't seen before, which is kind of annoying because he is taking on, I would say, a pretty difficult matchup for Ante Delija, just given the fact that this is another striker, a guy who I would argue has a bit of talent at the 265-pound division. Yes, he lost an absolute snoozer to the GOAT, Pav. I love Pav, though. He beat Spivak, which was just a win, which was just really impressive at the time to me anyway, because I did pick Spivak to beat him. And then he beat Span, and I picked Span. I picked Span to beat him as well. And then I actually probably picked the Spain to beat him as well. He showed a lot of wrestling in these matchups, actually. But what I'm trying to tell you is I'm not good at picking Waldo Cortez Acosta fights. There are fighters out there like Rainier de Ritter, who I haven't picked a fight correct of his career since he beat GM3, by the way. I picked against him, and then I picked him against Allan. Cortez Acosta, now looking back at it, is one of those guys which I can recognize that he's quite good. I just didn't think that he was able to be one of those guys that could beat the top 15 of the division. And now he's taking on Ante Delija, and I think Delija's kind of got a tough fight for him. But the thing about Delija is he does train with Espinal, and I know that Espinal just got eye poked, and it's probably going to be a bit of a downing situation for the team. But I mean, it's a title defense at the end of the day. Still, it does go on the stats. But I think for Delija, I think Delija does beat him, because if Delija's training with Espinal and Cortez Acosta, I can't believe I'm saying this out loud, I think actually do kind of present somewhat similar skill sets, where Espinal and Acosta both have good boxing, whereas Acosta does throw a lot of leg kicks. And I would say that Espinal is throwing a very surprisingly high amount of kicks against Garn as well. He's trying to kickbox Garn, which is quite odd. Not expected to me anyways. So I think that, honestly, Delija getting those rounds in with Espinal will prepare him well for someone like Waldo Cortez Acosta. And even like Mitch Parkin as well, for the wrestling sort of aspect too, is probably a guy that he's looking at. I think that Delija does win this fight. I will admit I was leaning Delija, but with very low confidence. I think now that I'm kind of talking myself through it, I think that I have kind of put things together that does make sense to me anyway to pick Delija as a plus 120 underdog in this fight. And now Steve Garcia fights against David Onama in the main event. Now, I feel like I'm just beating a dead horse at this point, because it's just never come into fruition, and maybe it never will, because Steve Garcia has been on a crazy run. I still worry about Steve Garcia's chin. To this day, it scares me. And he is now fighting someone who can crack it, because Steve Garcia, you guys, I don't forget these things, okay? One of my favorite UFC fighters of all time, Charlie Ontiveros, a man who I famously picked to beat Gabriel Benitez, by the way. What was I thinking? Dropped Steve Garcia twice. He dropped him twice, and then Mahashati slipped him. So I have seen Steve Garcia dropped, I have seen him hurt, I have seen him knocked out. But here's the thing. He just hasn't mattered recently. He's just started to look so good. He came down to 145 pounds, outlasted Shayla Nudenbeki, who gassed out against him in that fight with the wrestling. Beat Malcazal Costa, which is a fantastic win. I think Costa's a very talented fighter. Knocked out Sungwoo Choi on the feet. Once again, Sungwoo Choi, a Muay Thai national champion for South Korea, somehow with only a left hook, knocked him out. Knocked out Carnelossi, a win that is going to age pretty well, I think, actually, to be honest with you. And then he beat Calvin Kattar. Calvin Kattar. I can never say his name correctly. By decision. And I am going to be looking at the stats for this one here because he went the distance with Calvin Kattar. And he outlanded him 85-26 on the significant strike count. And neither of those two attempted a takedown. And I'm going to actually kind of mention this website. So MMA Joey, there's this website called UFC Stats, and you can use it to look at the stats of fighters. So when you are tweeting that Umar Nurmagomedov is primarily a kickboxer, all you need to do is go to the stats. You don't even need to watch the Nate Menes fight. You don't even need to watch the fight against Mario Batista, which you got 11 takedowns against. All you need to do is look at the stats and see that he averages more than 1 takedown per round, MMA Joey. And then you will see that Umar Nurmagomedov is not primarily a kickboxer. He's primarily a wrestler. We can now move on to this matchup here. Steve Garcia, as I was saying, he's on a great run and just beat Calvin Kattar. He just beat Calvin by decision, dominantly, over 3 rounds. And I know that Calvin hasn't been the same since he injured his leg against Arnold Allan, and that is a shame because he actually was looking quite good against Arnold Allan in that fight, I did think. Yeah, it was against Arnold Allan. The Max Holloway fight was a complete different beating. Oh my goodness. Now, David Onama. This is a guy who I will admit I have had my doubts about in the past. You know, against Nate Landwehr. As soon as he lost to Landwehr, I was like, oh, this guy's cardio is not very good. This guy's takedown defense isn't very good. Yes, he dropped Landwehr, but, you know, I did have my concerns regarding the takedown defense, regarding the cardio. And once again, I will say he has kind of continued to prove me wrong a little bit. He beat Gabriel Santos, who I think is quite good. And especially at that time was, I would say, even though he lost to Murphy, I mean, he lost to Murphy by split decision, which was very, very close, I want to say. And he beat Jose Delano, who's going to be a very big threat in the UFC as well. Beat JSP, and that's a great win because Jonathan Pierce is a massive guy and I think with big wrestling and not good cardio, but he's massive with good wrestling. And then against Roberto Romero, the doubts started to creep back in, you know, because Roberto Romero, I don't think is very good. And he came in on short notice and he gave Onama a pretty tough fight in that matchup. And I think that it's a win that's going to age poorly, but it was short notice. But I think the performance was just not very good. He got pressured a lot by Romero, which scared me. Then he beat Giga Chikadze. I do think in this fight, Garcia wins. I hope I have said that earlier before I step-by-stepped everyone through both of their UFC's careers. But I am a little bit worried about the power that Onama does have. The thing about Garcia, though, is that he just has proven to me that he can push a heavy pace over 3 rounds. Maybe he can push that over 5. Yes, Onama's cardio's looked good recently, but still in the past. I'm more than aware that fighters can improve, but it is still something that I do worry about to this day, just given the performance against Landwehr and just given some other performances as well, which he has started to slow down a little bit. I think that Garcia is going to be able to push it for 5 rounds if he needs to. Plus, I think out of these 2 guys, the more well-rounded fighter is Steve Garcia because Garcia can wrestle offensively, and I don't think that Onama necessarily has that level of wrestling in his back pocket that Garcia does. So I'm going to be picking Steve Garcia to win this fight. I don't know if he wins by knockout, you know. I think if he wins by knockout, it's going to be quite late in the fight. Like, I'm talking round 3, round 4, maybe round 5, because Onama's gassed out. So I'm going to probably more so lean the decision side, but the fact that Garcia does have good finishing ability and still can put it on Kattar late in the fight in the 3rd round, I think maybe there is definitely sort of means for a finish late in the fight, but I think it's going to have to come after Onama has kind of gassed out. And the thing as well that I think I am somewhat confident in this fight is that I think Onama is going to hurt Steve Garcia at one point. I think Onama has that level of power. He has that level of kickboxing. And I think that eventually, maybe one day, he is going to kind of crack that defense of Garcia. But I think that Garcia is going to kind of not get slept by it. I think he's just going to keep going. So I'm going to pick Steve Garcia, minus 120 favorite against Onama here. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.